Hey, Jennifer.
Hey, Monica.
Jen, I'm super excited about our interview today. I've been hoping to feature this guest for a long time. Can you introduce her to our listeners?
Absolutely. So today we're speaking with Helena Norberg-Hodge. Helena is the founder and director of Local Futures, a nonprofit committed to restoring ecological and social well-being by revitalizing local communities and economies. She's widely recognized as a pioneer of the localization movement.
And her vision is a world where most of our food is grown by nearby farmers, where money we spend stays within the community, and where local businesses are flourishing. Listen, everyone needs to have access to meaningful and fulfilling work, and this is the vision of Helena's.
It's so amazing. Helene is also the author of two books, the best-selling Ancient Futures, Lessons from Ladakh for a Globalization World, and Local is Our Future, Steps to an Economics of Happiness.
From Helena's perspective, localizations is a solutions multiplier, and we're going to talk more about that. It's really the key to addressing major changes like economic inequality, climate change, and even the erosion of democracy.
In this conversation, we talk with Elena about the pitfalls of our deeply globalized economy, how communities can transition towards more localized systems, and why tight knit communities tend to be more connected to nature.
So let's get to our conversation with Helena Norberg-Hodge. Helena, welcome to Biophilic Solutions. How are you?
I'm very good and happy to be here.
Yeah, we are so excited. Katrina was doing so much research. We are all talking about you before, so we're thrilled that you're joining us today.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, before we talk about solutions, which we always like to sit in hope and solutions here, we'd love to sort of dig into the problem or the challenges, as we sometimes say. And so the question really is, what are the most pressing problems that have resulted from our globalized economic system?
Well, first of all, it's really important for people to realize that it is the globalized economic system that has created the multiple crises we have today.
Hmm.
Most people don't realize that. And it's because this has been going on at that far removed global level.
Hmm.
And instead, what they're seeing is government, government squeezing them more with regulations, squeezing them more with taxes, and seemingly, making them poorer and making life more difficult. And so then you get a very dramatic swing to the right, meaning we just want government out of the way,
Hmm.
which essentially leads to laissez-faire economics and lets this, what is now a sort of interlinked corporate empire,
Mm.
gives that even more power and freedom to come into our regions and our nation states. So I'm very, very glad that you're starting by saying the problems that this globalized economy has led to. And I'm personally very, very motivated to talk a fair amount about that because I think once you study it, you realize that there's not really an enemy. There's no blame to be assigned
Hmm.
particular corporations or particular individuals. Both left-leaning and right-leaning governments have been systematically supporting the
Hmm.
deregulation of global trade, and that has meant freeing up global banks and global businesses to do as they like. And so, it's been both left and right, and it's been sad that both environmental and social activists have generally not been aware of this. And it's been partly with the help of global corporations that haven't wanted us, of course, to be looking at that system. So there's been it's been rather difficult to get this out into the media, which is essentially controlled by global corporation. And that's why it's really important that we have podcasts like this and women like you who are happy to try to get the big picture out. But
Yeah.
essentially, I suppose the really simple, clear message that we need to get out is that as I say, both left and right, and that includes socialist governments like my native government of Sweden, they have systematically created more poverty,
Hmm.
meaning that the poverty has been rising upwards to now middle-class people throughout the industrialized world who are struggling to pay the mortgage, pay the rent, put healthy, good food on the table that's affordable.
Mhm.
And as they struggle, they then often become more and more disenchanted with government and make the problem worse. And on the other side, the environmental crises we're facing have been framed in a way that means that vested interests, corporate heads, and so on, have, understandably, they've been funding the environmental movement and they've been encouraging a look at individual symptoms.
Mhm.
So forestry over here and chemicals over there, and climate as a more and more central issue. And the whole climate issue, both how it's framed and the solutions, has been run by global corporations.
Mhm.
And it's been tragic because the narrow focus on carbon has meant that
Yep.
they, as giant businesses, have been able to trade ever more over greater distances, breaking up and destroying the local economic fabric, and then, having food and shoes and building materials shipped across the world. And the emissions from that global trade are nowhere mentioned in the COPs.
I know.
And then in the meanwhile, the whole framing is that it's the ordinary, it's humanity that doesn't care. Humanity is greedy. They just want to hold on to what they have, and they're not willing to make the sacrifices they need to make to solve the climate issue. So it's a very, very, very sad that there's this narrow and very corporate framing. So it's very
Mhm.
important we get the bigger picture out.
That kind of perfectly it articulates exactly all those points and like all the pain points of what we're all facing, because what you just said, Helena, is that we're not hearing the real message, right? I didn't mean to
Yeah.
interrupt you, Monica, but everything you just said, I was like, oh my gosh, that's exactly it. Like, where no one's hearing the real message, and that
Yeah.
we're kind of pushing, everything. And, to be successful, you have to be global. That's what's been, put into everyone's brain, that to be a real successful business person or business, whatever it might be, that you have to reach a global, market, instead of thinking more local,
Mhm.
and how important that really is.
Yeah. And that's been particularly disastrous, you see, when you go to primary production. And that is, how do humans use soil, water, forests to meet their needs? And
Mm.
even though that's been pushed out of sight, it's
Mhm.
still the most important thing that's going on, to feed us, to clothe us, to provide building materials, everything we need, even the electronic gadgets, even now the robots, depend on the earth. And
Mm.
so abusing that real economy and polluting and trashing it more and more, it's just a disaster for everybody. And so it's the big picture, I do believe, can bring people together in a way that a narrow focus can't. And I really do believe that 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 this could happen.
Mhm.
Often say, no, no, the sort of yeah, there's no chance of changing the bigger system. I
Mhm.
think that's one of the biggest, worst ideas around. Uh,
Mhm.
yeah.
There was I don't know if you've heard, there's a podcast called Drilled, which is an environmental podcast, really wonderful. And I came into them, I don't even know, 5 or 6 years ago. One of their first sort of arc was sort of the behind the scenes on the gas, you know, and companies and the PR that they, the carbon footprint that they created. They said, oh, you have to worry about your carbon footprint. You're the problem. It's not us drilling the oil, it's you. And it really opened up, how they knew for years and years and years about the environmental degradation, and they just exploited it and then hid it. And so, I'm a big believer that, like, once you
Mm.
know. And if
Yeah.
you are, a good, caring person, which most of us are, that's going to move you, and then you can't unsee it. So
Yeah.
that's part of what we're trying to always do here, is sort of educate in a very what we hope is an accessible way, that isn't too screechy, isn't, conspiracy theory. It's just like these are the facts.
Yeah.
And so much of it has been, the media, hides it. And whether that's intentional or, just who
Yeah.
they've become, sort of to give them
Well,
the break.
well, I know that to some extent it's intentional, but in other ways it's very hard to um, figure it out. Because many times when I've been interviewed around the world, they've left out about the trade treaties, and the trade treaties really have been the central thread in
Hmm.
these last 50 years that I've been active. It's been this essentially regulations
Hmm.
made by corporations
Mhm.
inhibiting governments from doing anything to regulate them. So, and that's been, translating into literally taking governments to court if they
Mhm.
try to raise the minimum wage or if they try to protect their country from pollution. The most recent one is, uranium mining company from Australia suing Greenland for more than their GDP because Greenland decided we don't want any more uranium mining. And again, the amazing thing is this Australian uranium company, it's not that they're mining in Greenland to bring uranium to Australia. Not at all. They've got plenty of uranium there. But it's this global system, they'll be mining there to sell somewhere else. And very often, as we're seeing, you can have the import and export of the same product because all the time the focus is on the longer distances, which allows more extraction to the top.
Mhm.
Say with farming, if you have, let's say that tomorrow, all around the world, people would eat only food from their region or their country, no multinational would make money.
Right.
And so it has been necessary to break those connections in order to extract the wealth to the top. And that's why we have the insanity of importing and exporting the same product.
Mhm. Well, and you hear stories like we've had people on where, they're catching the fish in one country, they're
Yeah.
shipping them to another country to be deboned, and then they're freezing them and shipping them back
Yeah.
to sell them. Or soybeans is another one.
Yeah.
Soybeans from America are going overseas to create tofu, and then they're coming
Yeah.
back.
Yeah.
It
And you see the logic and what's so scary is that young investors sitting in their high-rise offices figuring out how to make money. I mean, I've known of examples where they claimed that hazelnuts were exported from America and then brought back in again. They didn't actually leave, but it allowed for this make-believe increase in
Wow.
extractive wealth because they pretended that they had been. I mean, the craziness of what's going on. Also, windmill farms bunged up in the north of Sweden. The forests are clear cut for these windmill farms, and
Mhm.
there's almost no wind. And there's
Oh
a
my
Belgian
God.
who made a film about this. Looked at, well, who's doing this? And then it was one investment firm after another and this paper wealth created. And that is also what's scary is that money is being created out of thin air.
Mhm.
No connection to real wealth at
Well,
all.
we
Completely.
we we don't even want to talk about crypto. I mean, that's a
Yeah.
whole nother scheme. So talk to us about, because if the governments and the corporations are really saying it's your problem, you need to recycle. I'm not going to take the plastic out of my. I mean, we're not going to get rid of plastic soft drink cans. You know, you've just got to recycle them, which we know on the back end is not happening efficiently. You know, it, it's not as if we are the solution for some of those bigger problems. The corporations really have to take responsibility. But you do believe, and I think we do as well, that localization, so, different, can be a solutions multiplier. Can you tell us what that means and how does that work?
Well, first of all, it works in that as people around the world have either understood conceptually the bigger picture or even if they haven't really seen the bigger picture, they've just intuitively wanted, especially fresh, local, organic food,
Mm,
transported shorter distances. There's
mm,
a lot
mhm.
of chefs around the world, especially who want fresh seasonal food. And very often they will be providing or cooking, in very high-end restaurants. And so that means that there have been people with a bit of influence who become interested, like my friend Alice Waters. I don't know if you.
Yes, we love Alice.
Yeah, and she's been a friend for, yeah, almost 50 years. And so so this has been happening from the bottom up, but localization, as we're promoting it, is also raising awareness about the bigger picture to try to build up a
Mm,
more conscious and a more educated
Mm,
public, and
mhm,
particularly thinking in terms not of people who are struggling to pay the mortgage and who may only have time to sit in front of television at night. And we're not talking about the sort of mainstream, but we're talking
mhm,
about what is a very large number of people who really do care and
mhm,
want to do the right thing. And they include philanthropists, they include people who really had the fortune to maybe either inherit a bit of money or maybe quite a lot of money, or
mhm,
people who've retired. They may not have, buckets of money, but they actually want to do something,
mhm,
heal the planet and people. And it's this bringing the picture together with that bigger picture. We offering a platform and a series of facts and an understanding of the bigger picture that could bring people together across specific concerns. So they may only, those well-intentioned people, now be focusing on climate. They may only be focusing on what's happening to sharks, what's happening to dolphins, what's happening to plastic, what's happening to children who are being abused. They feel worried about the aged. They're worried about our health. They're worried about democracy. So all of these issues actually
mhm.
emanate from this globalized system and a culture that's being pushed on us to
Yeah.
consume more and more, and a culture that's being pushed on us to tell us that it's only life in the city center that is meaningful and productive. And so it's been part of a trajectory of driving us away from land, away from community, into bigger and bigger anonymous cities. So
Mhm,
once people see that bigger picture, we're expecting that it will turn into a political demand
mhm,
from both left and right and green politicians, whatever color they are, to end this craziness of allowing this global corporate empire to run the world and to run their own country.
mhm,
And unlike Trump, we're not seeing the enemy as other countries who are working against us or immigrants who are pouring into our country. However, the immigration issue is exacerbated by this corporate system that loves uprooting, you know, removing people from the land, destroying local economies. That is an absolute necessity for the global wealth creation.
mhm,
So there is a sort of enemy in that system. It's just that it's not individual people or individual government. But understanding that bigger picture will lead to political pressure. At the
mhm,
moment, it is already happening that local governments and mayors are beginning to respond to the
mhm.
common sense that
Yes.
everywhere in the world, people would be better off if they were allowed to subsidize and support
Mm,
healthy local food, building materials transported shorter distances,
mhm,
rebuilding the fabric of an interconnected, more localized economy. Everywhere in the world is in people's interest. And as pressures are building up, we're seeing, as I say, some mayors and some local governments beginning to make changes. But we want as many people as possible, anyone listening here, to also put out the big picture. So then all of these people who do care, who are spending time and money to make the world a better place, can sing to the same hymn sheet. Doesn't mean they now say, I don't care about my issue of plastic or dolphins or children. That's still my main focus. But
Mhm.
I know that making changes to this economic system is going to be one of the most beneficial and the sort of systemic
Mm.
shift that we need to
Mhm.
really everything we care about.
I mean, Monica and I talk about this all the time, Helena. That's spot on because I always think everyone talks the global economy, the global worth, the global everything. But Monica and I always talk about is that we can't protect or think about globally if we're not even experiencing our own backyard. So what's happening locally
Yes.
on our own street, in our own neighborhood, maybe it's like 200 people in our community, whatever it is, we can't think that big if we're not concerned with the minute, the small, the granular of our own community, like what's making us healthy, what's making us not healthy. Like, and I'm seeing a lot of mayors, like you're saying, I've seen quite a few mayors now putting more of a spotlight on the nature component, and the health benefits of natural landscapes and then getting our fresh food from our local environments. So you really put a nail on the head with that one for sure.
Well, I'm so glad that you're seeing that because, people who aren't looking closer to the ground today are feeling very depressed and
Yes.
disheartened. And it's very often those people I'm talking about that we want to mobilize who
Yeah.
are people who are actually thinking about the state of the world.
Mm.
But I've witnessed how the corporate, and I knew many of the really well-intentioned corporate people, well, as they got involved with these environmental issues, well, it was sort of natural in a way. They weren't going to look at their own shadow. And so then when they started influencing things, it wasn't, in many cases, it wasn't through ill intention, but they were
Sure.
still in this hot seat of needing to earn money and to take responsibility for the thousands of people they were employing. And the framing of the issues was always that growth through trade is going to benefit everybody.
Mhm.
That overriding goal they got away with steering people away. And you know what you were saying, how can we be looking after people on the other side of the world if we don't even see the people in our community, we don't
Mm-mm.
know them? And we've had this idea that now we're going to become really enlightened and we're going to feel compassion for
Mhm.
everyone on the planet. You can't actually feel compassion for someone you've never seen, whose name you don't know.
Right.
We're
So true.
feeling compassion for a word on the screen. These poor people in the third world, and we're now meant to feel compassion for them. Of course, we want to be concerned with those issues, and of course, we want to minimize it. But what I know from experience is that if people don't have a sense of security in their own communities, if they don't have a sense of belonging, they often become very vulnerable to the fear mongering and, just blaming the other. And
Gosh,
Yep.
they
yes.
don't have the security that it takes to be kind and compassionate and collaborative.
Mhm. Well, and I think that you said earlier, a conscious and educated public, and that's something that I think about quite a bit. That goes back to the like once you know, but consciousness or mindfulness is just another level of it of really listening and really thinking and really understanding. And there's so much coming at us so quickly. We mentioned Douglas Rushkoff earlier and the internet and all the digital media, and so much of that has exacerbated the consume, the consume, the consume. You get on Instagram and all it does is send you stuff to buy.
Uh-huh.
Um, so the local futures, talk a little bit about that, the nonprofit.
Yeah, Local Futures is my little organization that grew out of having ended up on the Tibetan plateau in this place called Ladakh, which is the westernmost part of Tibet. That is a
Mhm.
part of Tibet that belongs politically to India. And so when the Chinese had come into central Tibet the Indians had placed army on the border, and the border was under dispute. And on the other side of this western part of Tibet is Pakistan, and that border was also under disputes from
Mm.
40s onward. So all the borders had been protected by military, and no one was allowed to go there. And so that meant that in the modern era, after the Second World War, this very ancient indigenous Tibetan culture hadn't been influenced by modernity. And then it turns out that earlier, when missionaries had gone out there, already from about the 1600s onwards,
Mhm.
they hadn't succeeded in converting people. And now my theory is that the Tibetan Buddhism incorporated the more feminine, indigenous,
Mm.
deeply nature-based spirituality,
Mhm.
um, incorporated it, didn't kill it off, but because that also had men with left brain interest, very engaged in debating and discussing the Buddhist philosophy of, and basically the message is that everything is inextricably connected,
Mm.
which is very similar to the ancient indigenous, more feminine, organic
Mhm.
worldview, but is a bit more intellectualized. Anyway, that is probably why when the missionaries came, they were only able to convert a few orphans. So
Mm.
when I arrived there in the mid 70s, I had this amazing privilege of getting to know a culture that had maintained its deep self respect for its own cultural wisdom, which was that everything is interconnected and that, we are part of that living web of relationships, that peace of mind is
Mm.
one of the most important goals, and that peace generally is a central goal for us. So I also I encountered people who, from that deep self-respect, both individual and cultural, were the most chilled out, essentially joyous people I had ever encountered.
Mm.
So I had gone out as a part of a film team. I was a linguist and I had already learned about 6 languages. And now I had been asked to pick up this ancient dialect, which was very challenging. It's a very complex language. But I was so motivated and I was greeted with so much love and appreciation. Everyone was, because people were very secure and
Yeah.
very open and friendly.
Mhm.
And so I just fell in love with the people, and I ended up staying when the film was finished. And then from then on, for 40 years, I was there for every year. And I witnessed and got to know very deeply. And I mean, I should have written about 10 books. I've only really written one
It's not
book.
it's not too late. Keep going.
Yeah, well, the problem is that I really so resist writing because it becomes much more linear. And what I'm trying to share is so organic, so holistic, and as you can see, all over the place. So it's a real struggle for writing, but I would have loved to write about childcare, about, well, so many things, the role of women, the role, yeah, a million things. But, um, but I did, got to get to know, and the ancient culture, there was, for me, it's now sort of my Bible. Whenever I'm thinking about what's going on with almost any issue, I go back to think, how did they do it? Because the fact is, things work so well there. It doesn't mean that other people everywhere can do exactly the same, but there are certain basic principles that I think are profound for us to learn from. And then I also got a very unusual perspective on how the dominant system operates, because I had this
Mm.
contrast between this ancient, deeply nature embedded, more feminine, organic way of living, and that turns out to be localized economies that are fundamental in that. But I only learned that as I saw these crazy things happening, like suddenly butter arriving that had been transported for weeks, costing half the price of butter from 5-minute walk away. And
Mm.
that then opened my eyes to go back to Sweden. I ended up invited to many different parts of the world to speak about this. And that's mainly what I've been doing, is speaking for 50 years. And then everywhere I went, I was checking and I was saying, yeah, everywhere the local economy is being destroyed. Everywhere
Mhm.
farmers are being destroyed. Everywhere villages are being destroyed, and people are being herded into bigger and bigger urban sprawls. And everywhere, it turns out that the human response to living so crowded together and so alienated from nature leads to loneliness and alienation. You know, it's just such a strange thing that when people live in a more nature-based way, they also look each other in the eye and say hello and know
Yes.
each other. And when they live in these crowded urban centers, suddenly you don't know
Shut
anyone
down. Mhm.
because it's
I'm
so
getting
natural. It's
point
so
A to B. Yeah,
yeah,
it is. And it is, and it is when you can be in a city with all these people around you and you're just lonely.
yeah,
It's such a dichotomy,
yeah, yeah.
but
And
it's
I was
true.
living in Paris before I went to Ladakh, and I realized that I would be really worried if on the weekend I didn't have lots of plans to see other people and would feel that sense of loneliness that I never ever feel in nature.
Mhm.
I also, yeah, I became aware when I go back to Sweden in the mid 70s that Sweden at that time, even now, is held up as a sort of model country. But so what I discovered was that it was so obvious why people were depressed. You know, now I could understand why even I would get depressed because they were so cut off from nature and from each other. And it's the two that we need, the deep connection to others and to nature.
So one of the things that I think I want to talk about by having that deeper connection to nature and shifting to a more localized economy. Um, and even the word economy is sort of this, like, I don't know what that means. It's this thing out here. We can't really, this is all these are all economy, right? But it's like more a localized experiential lifestyle. Maybe I don't know, like trying to give people, how do we connect people to these ideas that are, globalization, trade, tariffs? It's like, I don't know how that affects me day to day. I mean, until but to talk about shifting to the localized economy, one of the things that I can think of, and I think you think of, is, food. And I'm heartened by probably the past 10 years or so, farmers markets and local farmers. It's still a tremendously hard job and not super profitable. But we have so many farmers markets now, right? And
Yes.
that's really exciting. So that's a great example of how you can support, support the local economy. Talk about some other ideas and
Well,
concepts.
I'd love first to just emphasize more about the food and to
Hmm.
say that also in America, I started promoting it in the late 80s, early 90s. And this, something called community supported agriculture
Yep.
had taken off in Europe.
Yep.
And so I was talking about that in America as well. And people like Alice were sort of doing local, but they weren't really thinking about the global. And so they weren't necessarily emphasizing local. And
Right.
that's still a very big problem that a
Hmm.
lot of food activists and people concerned with quality food and organic and so on are not aware of why it's so important to shorten the distances. But the
Right.
distance between the farm and the market determines whether the farmer is being encouraged to diversify
Hmm.
or to do bigger and bigger monoculture.
Yep.
And when you
That's
do
great.
monoculture, just one thing, even if it's just chickens or if it's just hazelnuts or just cauliflower, when you do that, it is so unnatural that it inevitably causes more problems with pests
Hmm.
and so
Yep.
on. And you also have the fear of losing everything if there's some particular pest or a hailstorm or drought. Whereas when you have
Hmm.
diversity, you're much, much more secure and you're working with this natural in a natural situation where you don't have such a big problem with the pests and so on. So it's a very, very important understanding that that shorter distance literally means you can have a market which encourages ecological production, because
Mm.
diversity on the ground is absolutely fundamental to our well-being.
Mhm.
And then when you also realize that in our entire evolution, we were connected to the sources of our food, then you also see why we have such remarkable and now ever growing evidence of when people get involved with, say, community supported agriculture or community gardens, or children learn how to grow food. There is something in our DNA that it
Mm.
resonates so deeply and is proving to be very healing for
Mhm.
people with depression. It's usually also intergenerational,
Yes.
so that's another aspect that's key in terms of learning from indigenous culture, is moving away from this segregation into separate age groups. So that's again a human monoculture that's been cultivated
Mm.
by the global system, and it's with schooling as well. And why in the Steiner schools and many alternative schools they try to avoid such extreme isolation into these peer groups, that it,
Right.
just like just rows of cauliflower, it ends up being toxic. It's really so yeah, the local food movement, which has really taken off from actually from the 90s, and it's just the most amazing, thrilling thing that almost every initiative that started usually has continued,
Mhm.
even though it's so difficult. Because in the meanwhile, in that period, our governments have been supporting the opposite.
Yep.
So the subsidies, regulations, taxes, everything make it more difficult. But
Mm.
that's where I feel so inspired by the conviction that
Yes.
human beings have that deeper DNA wisdom and a real need to reconnect. That it's a fundamentally about a path of reconnection. And when it's happening around food and hands in the soil and with seeds and so on, it's particularly enjoyable
Mhm.
and just remarkable that it's able to keep growing
Mm.
despite, it's like being beaten over the head with all kinds of, the supermarket offering these artificially low prices,
I know.
and then still these really healthy alternatives are able to survive. So,
Well, mm,
building on that, what's also happening is that people start recognizing how profound and deep their need is for more community.
mm,
And and that means for more connection. That means for living in a place where people do know each other and where they do look after each other. And and I've seen the most beautiful marriage, particularly around the farmers markets again, where farmers who are often very conservative, they've been trained to
mhm.
believe, I've got to do monocultures, I've got to use these chemicals, you can't do it otherwise. But once we set up farmers market, and there's suddenly a lot of the shoppers are more green and left leaning, and they actually don't mind if the carrot is crooked
Yep.
or if it has a blemish on it. That's almost a mark that it's been grown in a healthy way. So here
Mm.
they are suddenly, like one farmer said to me, it's like entering another galaxy. I've been a farmer my whole life, and we were being treated like serfs, pressured all the time for a lower price and these unnaturally straight, shiny products.
Yep.
And now suddenly here we are, and I've gone from only growing one thing to growing 18 different things. So those are, so I can't stress enough really. Anyone interested in this, I would urge them to look at food and farming as the strategic thing to focus on first. But when you build on that, to really look at how you can reconnect people, and that also means old and young, paying
Mhm.
attention to more intergenerational connections, when you can also start moving beyond that to all kinds of things like, for instance, tool libraries, where people realize everyone doesn't need to have all of these things, but they set up a community center where they
Yeah.
can exchange, borrow tools. They also often support crafts and skills because
Mhm.
they realize that in the dominant global economy, things are made more and more to break as fast as possible,
Yeah.
built-in obsolescence. But they now start cherishing tools and ways of repairing things. So they'll often have like a repair cafe. And again, this can often become a meeting place.
Mhm.
And some of the stories that we hear are like a local group that wants to have a center like this where these things are going on. It can be quite difficult with the rents going up and finding a space that is in the center of a town.
Mhm.
And one of the recent stories that was so heartwarming was a group persuading the owner of the property to lower the price a bit for the community group.
It's great.
And then a few months later, he came back and voluntarily lowered it even more because he said, I
Mhm.
love what you're doing. These
That's
stories
great.
are real.
I know.
People want to do something that is beneficial. And if they can, they
Yes.
will. And some of these centers, they also become centers for often things like community dance, community conversations that are very different from going to some large event and just listening, but people again connecting in a deeper way. Something that we would urge anyone listening to this to try to organize a group of their own with people in the area where they live. And this can be done in the big city, in the
Mhm.
middle of the big city. Show a film or something which is about this deep reconnection to others and to nature. And what we're saying is this is a path that can make you feel better and happier from today till tomorrow, as
Mhm.
well as offer a systemic path to heal the planet.
Mhm.
And so this is a very big promise we're making, is that this journey is really something that heals both the individual and the planet. And central to that is that you have conversations that are deep and meaningful and vulnerable,
Yes.
because we're not aware that the global system has grown by making us feel that if we're not perfect, we're nobody. So we've
Oh,
been pressured to
yep.
be perfect, perfectly beautiful, perfectly wealthy, perfectly intelligent, and then we feel inferior.
Yep.
When we learn that we can belong and that we can actually be loved and seen as imperfect as we all are,
Mhm.
that is one of the most important steps to healing.
Well, and I think that's the
Yeah.
security you mentioned earlier. To
Yes.
feel secure, you have to be loved and you have to be comfortable secure in that if you I think about, the past, five, a lot has happened culturally and in society from Me Too to the Black Lives Matter and all important movements. But I think there was almost a backlash of like, oh my God, I can't do anything. I'm scared to do anything, say anything that I'm going to get canceled or I'm going to do it wrong or I don't know the right terms to use. And so then we shut down and we don't want to talk about a subject.
Mhm.
So I think there's been some grace coming back into society a bit, but it's like I'm really interested in the Tibetan monks because it's like I'm sure there's this grace of we show up as we are and the flaws are okay. And as long as we're heading towards better, right? We can make mistakes, just don't make it again or again and and I just feel like society pushes us down and then we're in a fearful place and insecure and then
Yeah.
we're
But
scared to reach out.
again, when we say society pushes us down, it's so much through anonymous channels. And so it's
Yep.
been very much part of the internet as well as the mobile phone,
Yep.
even before the social media.
Yes.
And so, and before that, the sort of general media, television played a role in this
Very isolating.
glamorizing the perfect, and you were supposed to
Mhm.
And so then there you are in your family and you think, oh, it's so boring. We don't have the same sex life we did when we were 20. And oh, and we're supposed to be, so much better. And then people behind their four walls are isolated in this little nuclear family and not realizing that virtually everybody is having the same issues.
Mhm.
So that's where coming together in a local group and with, finding people who are roughly on the same page, who are mature enough to want to explore these things on a journey where they're also willing to be
Mm.
vulnerable, to talk about
Mhm.
their problems, and doing it in human scale groups in each other's homes.
Mm.
That's my
Mhm.
favorite formula. My dream is that this will happen on a much larger scale and that is what will really start a revolution, a real revolution that will be a compassionate, kind, nonviolent refusal to go along with this commercial path that takes
Mhm.
us further and further from nature, from one another, and from ourselves.
Mm.
So it's coming back home to who we really are through that deeper connection. And we are all imperfect. And I love AA, even though I've never been close to it. But ever since I spent, the first couple of years in Ladakh and became aware that, depression, suicide, I mean, they were just unknown. And that here with these people who are just so deeply content, once I
Mm.
learned the key in that, which was very much about those closer relationships, the oldest and the youngest together,
Mhm.
every mother having like 10 caretakers for every child, so
Mhm.
that the child was surrounded by so many people that would carry the child, including siblings learning to care, both for young children and animals. All of that created a caring culture that was so
Mhm.
beneficial for everybody. So we can't come back to that overnight, but it's remarkable how much of that we could do
Mhm.
if we could join a group so that in this terrible system where maybe the biggest crime of all is that we're also time poor.
Mm.
This is absolutely working against who we are. To care, to listen, to
Yeah.
nurture a child, to nurture a plant, to look after animals takes time.
Mhm.
And we're all feeling rushed and we're all blaming ourselves.
Yep.
We need to look at this system, understand the role of technology, understand how and why. How did time suddenly become the most valuable commodity? It's all artificial.
Yeah. Well, I think it might have been, I don't know if it was the interview you did with Douglas, but talking about when the clock tower, the clock went up in the center of the square because suddenly time was labor and labor was money, and it became, that's when we started tracking time, right? And so again,
Fascinating.
that, right, and just
Yeah.
that, Jen,
Yep.
right, like just that can bring your consciousness up.
Yep.
Just so to me it's like these little, history is so important, community is so important, obviously nature, but talk a little bit as we're wrapping up on indigenous and like ecological knowledge systems. I obviously they've informed your vision for a sustainable, localized future. I love the tool library, Skillshare, Repair Cafe. We have a CSA here at Serenbe. It's huge, and the volunteering at the farm, and the kids go to the farm, and we have blueberry bushes on the sidewalks, and people come together to gather them, and they meet happenstance, and it's like the village is real again, right? The community is real, but talk about a little bit, what we can pull back from these indigenous cultures.
Well, again, just and not so much from the indigenous, but from where we are today. We
Mhm.
work with one of the best economists. Well, one of the economists who's alive now. I've worked with others who are unfortunately dead, but who promote localization. One of them is Michael Schumann, and he's been able in some places, like in Nova Scotia, to change regulations so people can actually invest in local
Mm.
their pension funds.
Hmm.
And that, again, makes a huge difference. And,
Mhm.
if we go around the world, everywhere in the world, people would agree that global businesses have too much power and money, and that it would be a good idea for government instead to support local businesses, local.
Mhm.
Everywhere in the world, people would agree with that. And what's very important about my organization, Local Futures, is that we're promoting this from a global perspective.
Mm.
If you don't, and you have to be careful because people on the left are often very worried that localization will be some selfish, privileged, middle class thing, where you don't
Mm.
care
Like a
about it.
NIMBY. Mhm.
And they don't realize that if wealthy middle class people in America start localizing, they're getting off the back of the Indians and the Chinese workers who are sitting there in sweat factories producing things for us. So it's
Mm.
actually completely the opposite of the truth.
Right.
But I think, yeah, one thing I also just want to recommend is that coming together to sing or chant together is another amazing healing, if you like, technology. I don't like to call it that, but it's a cultural practice that goes back through the thousands of years. And virtually every spiritual and religious tradition used it because it actually is a deep meditation and a deep embodied way of feeling connected. And so it's a
Mm.
wonderful thing to do also as part of a community group. And so another thing that we can learn from indigenous cultures is both about that singing together, but also we can do things like, if you like, vision quests or nature connection, things that don't have to be expensive. We can,
Mhm.
as a group, one person can try to find out where would be the closest place that we could go, say as a family group, to spend time in nature and to help shift things. It can be gently. It doesn't have to be everyone fasting for days. That's a very masculine interpretation of
Mm.
indigenous culture. In my indigenous culture, women never ever slept alone. Their whole lives they were always sleeping together with other people. Often in the daytime they might be out in nature and with the animals and so, but at night they would come together around the fire, even if it was in a shepherd's hut. So there are things that we could start doing, saving a bit of time if, one person in the group tries to identify the place and another person tries to help get the materials together that we might need. And then if we share, the load of the shopping and the cooking and so on, there's so much that we can accomplish as a group, even in a small group. And so that's why I'm hoping that we'll see this wake up to the benefit of creating these more intimate human scale groups and
Mhm.
even meeting in our homes. Um, I'm then hoping that we might have in another few years a sort of demonstration that again would not be people traveling across the world to just all meet in New York or London or something, that everyone would just go out of their houses and with their mobile phones show we want support for the local. We want to see support for community and nature worldwide. And we are saying a very loud no to the global commercial system.
That's
It's like a
it.
mic drop right there, Helena. Mic drop.
It is. That was
So
amazing.
it's incredible. And it is, it's what we need. And we need to just spread the word. We
Yes,
need to open people's
exactly.
eyes and spread the
Exactly.
word and come at everybody with kindness, not a wagging finger, but
Exactly.
what
Exactly.
if? What
Yeah.
if we tried this? What if we did this?
Yeah. And you see, this is also an invitation
Mm,
for you to feel happier and more connected. So it's not a wagging finger.
yeah.
It's not saying, why haven't you done your bit to reduce plastic? I mean,
Right. Right.
it drives me mad, this
I
talk.
know. I
Reduce
know.
plastic.
Showing people how you, instead of
Everybody's thinking
telling
the
people,
supermarket.
yeah, show
Sorry,
them.
Jennifer.
No,
What?
just saying, like what you're saying is show them, don't tell them. Show them the
Yep.
beauty of it. I mean, I think we all
Yes,
try
but
and do
even
that.
the showing, of course, one of the things that's key in this big picture activism is that we try to raise enough awareness so we can have more funds to make more films to
Yeah.
show, even what's happening in Serembe. There are examples of that around the world, and we need to gather more and then disseminate them
Yes.
as a matter of really of urgency. It's a
Mhm.
really because as you know, people don't see this generally and they're feeling very depressed and they become angrier also as they feel demoralized
Mhm.
and then all the time the algorithms in social media want to encourage this polarization.
Yep.
So it's toxic.
Yeah. No, we always are like, and in this, I think, not to again fangirl on Douglas Rushkoff, but his whole philosophy of Team Human was
Yeah.
such a mind blower for me when that
Yeah.
book came out. It's
It
such
was.
a simple premise,
Yes.
but it's exactly what we need, and now more than ever, right? I mean, it's only gotten more necessary that we're
Absolutely.
all on the same team.
Yes,
Mm.
absolutely, absolutely.
Let's do a
No,
little
I
ad
agree.
for
It's
him.
wonderful. Yeah, and I also wanted to tell you and the listeners that we're having a gathering of
Mm.
the people who are looking at this bigger picture and promoting localization in Ladakh. That's in this September,
Wow.
first week of
Okay.
September. People can find the information about that on our website, and it's the first week of September. And 2 years ago, we'd had a summit like that in England, and it was so inspiring,
I bet.
particularly because there were a lot of young people from all over the world, very energized, very strong. Because it is very energizing when you realize that there is this coming together of the personal well-being with the global well-being. I mean,
Yeah.
you really see it's not about, oh, well, I have to just focus on meditation and become peaceful on the inside. No, the inside and the outside are interconnected. So this is a perspective that shows
Mhm.
there's a way forward that actually recognizes that we need to work at both ends, both
Mhm.
the practical and the external and the inner work, and they go together. So it's really very empowering.
And they can find that on the Local Futures website?
Yes,
Great. Perfect.
localfutures.org.
We'll put it in our show notes,
Could do. And
localfutures.org.
also, it would be good to mention to people if they want to actively feel part of this movement, they could organize a local food feast or
Mm.
kind of celebration on June 21st because we have marked that as World Localization Day. So
Oh,
there are
wonderful.
people on every continent who are doing something and it really also raises the vibration, if you like, when people realize that this small local thing is actually part of a movement that's global
Yes.
and that it's as beneficial in China as it is in America,
Yeah.
as it is in Sweden.
Mhm. Well, Helena, this has been a pleasure. I know we've been worked really hard to get you with your busy schedule and the time difference, but I so appreciate your time and your knowledge and the work that you do.
Yeah.
Well,
Thank you.
thank you. I'm so happy to meet you, and it's what makes me so motivated. Honestly, it's mainly women who are the leaders in
I
this.
know, we've noticed.
We've been saying that. We hate to,
Yeah. Mother Nature.
our male counterparts, but Mother Nature needs us all. So
Yes, yes.
thank, thank
Yeah,
you so much.
really lovely to meet you. I hope we can keep collaborating.
Yes, we would love to. And I
Okay.
love localization today. We're going to follow you. Everybody needs to follow Helena and Local Futures. And if you can get to Tibet, go to Tibet in September.
And don't worry about your carbon footprint because the people who are promoting the most abject commercialization are
Oh,
traveling more than ever. And it's very unfortunate that people who actually care are not traveling. We need to travel to connect because keeping that division between so-called rich country and poor country is part of a system that's dividing us and preventing us from seeing the truth.
yes. Thank you for everything.
Thank
Beautiful.
you. Thank you.
Jen, blown away by her. Helena, unbelievable. I mean, we've had some incredible guests the past few weeks, but she God, her
Yeah.
just energy, she was fabulous.
Everything she said, I kept saying yes under my breath. Yes, 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 because she's so right. Because we've been pushed and pushed and pushed to think this globalized market is the end all to where we should be reaching towards. And I think we all innately know that really localization is the soul and the heart and the true nature of where we belong.
Yeah, and, we ended up talking to her for another half an hour after we stopped recording. We should have kept recording, but one of the things she said was localism is the ism to end all isms. And she really is like, if we can just think about living and adapting with diversity to a specific place, it really
Yes.
can start to
Yep.
solve things and reconnect people to each other and nature. I mean, we talk about this all the time. She could have been like an
Mhm.
ad for Biophilic Solutions.
She really could she really could have been, but she was so spot on, and she's been doing this for so long, and I love the fact that this isn't new to her. I mean, she's been doing this for 50 years, but that this thread that she's always followed has been more and more important than ever before because we have lost our way. But she's also been kind of saying, "Come on, we have to keep educating on the why." And like what you said, like loneliness, depression, because we are so separated from each other and from nature. So yeah, she was fantastic.
She was
Fan-
amazing. We're going to put everything in the show notes. Please follow her local futures. God, if you can get to Ladakh in September, that would be amazing. Jealous.
yes,
And we're gonna keep up with her. And I think, I'm a follower. I'm a
same.
Helena new
Oh,
fangirl. Yeah.
yeah, me too. Me too.
All right. Thanks, Jen.
Thanks, Monica. See everyone soon.
Bye.